June 6th, 1944. 6:31 inches the morning. The English Channel churned grey and cold beneath a sky thick with salt mist and the distant thunder of naval guns. Along the cliffs of Portsmouth, a cluster of British generals stood in silence, binoculars raised, watching the largest amphibious invasion in human history unfold across the water. The wind carried with it the metallic smell of diesel fuel and the faint, acrid taste of cordite. Beneath their polished boots, the chalk cliffs trembled with each salvo from the battleships offshore. They had planned this moment for years, calculated every variable, every risk. But nothing, no staff, college lecture, no North African campaign, no intelligence briefing had prepared them for what they were about to witness. The American soldier, stepping off landing craft into the teeth of German machine gun fire at Omaha Beach, was about to rewrite every assumption the British High Command held about modern warfare. For 3 years, Britain had borne the weight of the war in Europe. From Dunkirk to El Alamein, British and Commonwealth forces had learned to fight with discipline, caution, and the bitter economy of a nation stretched to its limit. Their generals, men like Montgomery, Brooke, and Dempsey, had been forged in the trenches of the First World War, where 100 yards of mud cost tens of thousands of lives. They understood war as attrition, as careful calculation, as the methodical grinding down of an enemy's will. They had mastered the art of doing more with less, of preserving their strength, of never committing to a fight they couldn't win. It was a philosophy born of necessity. Britain's manpower was finite. Every soldier lost was a village emptied, a generation thinned. And then came the Americans. In the months leading up to D-Day, British officers had watched with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism as American forces poured into England. They arrived by the hundreds of thousands, filling the countryside with tent cities and supply depots that seemed to stretch to the horizon. The sheer scale of it defied belief. Entire forests of equipment, tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, crates of ammunition stacked so high and so wide that it seemed as though the Americans intended to pave France with steel. British quartermasters, accustomed to rationing every round and every gallon of petrol, stared in disbelief at the mountains of supplies accumulating in English ports. One British staff officer, observing an American supply convoy, remarked to his aide, "Good God, they've brought enough material to invade Russia twice over." The British expected competence. What they did not expect was abundance on a scale that redefined the possible. But abundance alone does not win wars. On the morning of June 6th, as the first wave of American troops hit Omaha Beach, the British generals watched through their field glasses and saw something that turned their understanding of warfare inside out. The German defenses at Omaha were formidable concrete bunkers, overlapping fields of fire, mines, and obstacles designed to shred any landing force. Intelligence had underestimated the strength of the German 352nd Infantry Division, and the pre-invasion bombardment had failed to knock out most of the fortifications. As the ramps of the Higgins boats dropped, American soldiers waded into a storm of bullets. Men fell by the dozens in the first seconds. Bodies floated in the surf. Equipment sank into the sand. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire landing might collapse into catastrophe. And then the Americans did something the British had never seen before. They kept coming. Wave after wave, boat after boat, men climbed over the bodies of their comrades and pushed forward into the fire. There was no pause, no regrouping, no careful assessment of the tactical situation. There was only forward momentum, relentless and unyielding. British doctrine would have called for a withdrawal, a reassessment, a new plan. The Americans simply absorbed the casualties and drove on. Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, watching from the command ship, turned to a British colleague and said quietly, "They're not stopping. My God, they're not stopping." What the British were witnessing was not recklessness. It was something deeper, something cultural. The American soldier fought with a different calculus. Where the British Army rationed lives as carefully as ammunition, the American military operated under a philosophy of overwhelming material superiority applied with ruthless speed. They believed correctly that the fastest way to save lives was to end the war quickly, even if that meant accepting horrific casualties in the short term. It was a gamble, a national wager, made possible only by a country so vast and so productive that it could afford to think in terms of surplus. Every man who fell on Omaha Beach was backed by a factory in Detroit, a shipyard in Newport News, a training camp in Georgia. The British had never fought with that kind of depth, that kind of industrial faith. By midday, the situation at Omaha had stabilized. American engineers blew gaps in the seawall, destroyers moved to within 1,000 yards of shore and fired point-blank at German bunkers. Slowly, yard by yard, the Americans clawed their way up the bluffs. By nightfall, they had established a foothold. The cost was staggering, over 2,000 casualties on Omaha alone, but the beach was theirs. That evening, back at the Allied headquarters in Portsmouth, the British generals gathered for their after-action briefing. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and the low murmur of exhausted voices. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, overall ground commander for the invasion, stood before a map of Normandy, his expression unreadable. He had spent the day receiving reports from all 5 landing beaches. The British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword had achieved their objectives with relatively light casualties, thanks in part to specialized armored vehicles. Churchill tanks modified with flails to clear mines, flamethrowers to burn out bunkers. The Americans, offered these same vehicles, had declined. They preferred speed and simplicity over specialized equipment. Montgomery's chief of staff, Major General Francis de Guingond, cleared his throat. "Omaha was a near-run thing, sir. If the destroyers hadn't closed the range, if the follow-on waves had hesitated," he trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. Montgomery nodded slowly. "But they didn't hesitate," he said. "That's the point, isn't it? They didn't hesitate." General Sir Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, sat off to one side, scribbling notes in his diary. Later that night, he would write, "The Americans have a way of war that is entirely their own. It is profligate, brash, and at times almost careless of cost, but it is also unstoppable. We measure success by ground held and casualties minimized. They measure success by speed and momentum. Today, watching them at Omaha, I realized that they may be right. Wars are not won by caution." The British had expected the Americans to fight like Europeans, with the careful deliberation born of limited resources and bitter experience. Instead, the Americans fought like Americans, with the unshakable belief that no problem was too large to be solved by applying more men, more steel, more will. It was a philosophy that seemed wasteful, even naive, to officers trained in the economy of force, but on the beaches of Normandy, it worked. In the weeks that followed, as the Allies pushed inland, the pattern repeated itself. American commanders launched attacks that British officers considered reckless, throwing entire divisions at German positions without the weeks of preparation that British doctrine demanded. Yet again and again, the Americans succeeded. They accepted casualties that would have been considered catastrophic in the British Army, then replaced them within days from the seemingly bottomless well of American manpower. They burned through fuel and ammunition at rates that made British quartermasters wince, yet their supply lines never faltered. Every burned-out Sherman tank was replaced by 3 more. Every depleted rifle company was rebuilt overnight. General Miles Dempsey, commander of the British Second Army, watched in fascination as American logistics performed what seemed like miracles. He once remarked to an American counterpart, "You chaps don't fight a war. You bury the enemy in supplies until he suffocates." But it was more than just material abundance. The British generals came to recognize something else in the American soldier, a peculiar kind of initiative that seemed to violate every principle of military hierarchy. British troops were disciplined, obedient, and superbly trained to execute orders. American troops were all of those things, but they were also expected to think, to improvise, to take command when their officers fell. On Omaha Beach, when entire platoons lost their leaders, sergeants and corporals simply took over and kept pushing forward. There was no paralysis, no waiting for new orders from higher command. The Americans fought like a machine that could repair itself under fire. Lieutenant General Sir Miles Dempsey observed this phenomenon during the bocage fighting in July. British units, encountering the dense hedgerows of Normandy, adapted slowly, methodically, testing tactics until they found what worked. American units, faced with the same problem, improvised wildly. One American sergeant welded steel blades to the front of a Sherman tank, turning it into a hedgerow-cutting machine. Within days, hundreds of tanks had been modified in the field. No one had ordered it. No manual described it. The Americans simply saw a problem and fixed it. "They have no respect for proper channels," a British staff officer complained. "They just do things." "Yes," his superior replied, "and because they do things, they win." By August, as the Allies broke out of Normandy and began their race across France, the British High Command had come to a quiet, almost grudging admiration for the American way of war. It was not their way, it could never be their way, for Britain did not have the resources to fight with such extravagance. But it was effective, brutally, undeniably effective. Field Marshal Montgomery, never one to lavish praise lightly, wrote to the War Office, "The American Army has proven itself a formidable instrument. They bring to battle a combination of industrial might and individual initiative that is, I must confess, unlike anything we have fielded. They are not yet as tactically proficient as our own forces, but they compensate with sheer momentum and an almost reckless willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of decisive results. In short, they fight the way a wealthy nation fights, by spending blood and steel with the confidence that there is always more where that came from." It was, in its way, the highest compliment Montgomery could give. Throughout the campaign, one image recurred in British reports and diaries: the endless columns of American supply trucks, stretching back to the coast, carrying not just ammunition and fuel, but also fresh fruit, Coca-Cola, cigarettes, candy, even ice cream. British soldiers, rationed to the bone, watched in amazement as Americans ate steak and drank cold soda in the middle of a war zone. It became a symbol, not of decadence, but of something deeper. The Americans fought with the confidence of a nation that had never known scarcity, never been invaded, never faced existential threat. They waged war the way they built cities and factories, with optimism, excess, and an unshakable belief that the future belonged to those bold enough to seize it. Years later, after the war, General Sir Brian Horrocks, who commanded British XXX Corps, reflected on D-Day in his memoirs. "Watching the Americans land at Omaha," he wrote, "was like watching a force of nature. They took terrible losses, but they never wavered. In that moment, I understood that we were witnessing not just an invasion, but the passing of a torch. The British Empire had held the line for 3 long years, but it was the Americans who would deliver the final blow, not because they were better soldiers, they weren't, not yet, but because they had something we had lost, the luxury of thinking big." June 6, 1944, the day the world changed. British generals stood on the cliffs of England and watched their American allies storm the beaches of France. They expected competence. They witnessed transformation. The Americans brought to Normandy not just men and machines, but a philosophy of war rooted in abundance, initiative, and the unshakable belief that any problem, no matter how deadly, could be overcome by sheer determination and industrial might. In the cold mathematics of war, the British had learned to count the cost of every life, every bullet, every mile. The Americans counted only victories. And on that grey morning in June, as the surf of Omaha Beach ran red with blood, the British generals understood this was how the future fought. With all the wealth, all the courage, and all the terrible, beautiful abundance of a nation that believed, deeply and truly, that nothing was impossible. The tide had turned, and it would never turn back.